The auctioneer's voice carried across the muddy farmyard on a cold Saturday morning in November of 1983. Next up, Lot 42, 1953 Farmall Super M, runs, needs some cosmetic work. Good work tractor for somebody. Do I hear 1,500 to start? Silence. The tractor sat there in the weak autumn sunlight. Red paint faded to pink in places, one rear tire showing cracks, oil stains on the engine block. It looked exactly like what it was, a 30-year-old farm tractor that had worked hard and showed every hour. Martin Hayes stood near the back of the crowd, hands in his jacket pockets, watching. He'd come to this auction looking for a deal on implements, maybe a grain wagon, if the price was right. He hadn't planned on buying a tractor, but he knew this tractor, knew it had belonged to Ed Pritchard, a careful farmer who maintained his equipment religiously. Knew it had spent its entire life on one farm, never abused, always serviced. Knew it was mechanically sound, even if it didn't look pretty. 1,200, the auctioneer tried. Come on, folks, this is a good machine. Someone give me a bid. A man standing near the front spoke up loud enough for half the crowd to hear. That thing's worth scrap value at best, maybe 500 if you're desperate. Martin recognized the voice. Gary Summers, John Deere dealer from the county seat. Always at these auctions, always quick with an opinion about older equipment, always ready to remind farmers that modern meant better. The auctioneer looked annoyed. Sir, this tractor runs. It's worth more than scrap. Does it? Gary's voice dripped skepticism. Ed Pritchard couldn't even give that thing away before he died. Nobody wants these old Farmalls anymore. They're obsolete. A few people in the crowd nodded. Gary had a point, at least from where they stood. Why buy a 30-year-old tractor when you could finance something newer, bigger, more capable? Martin raised his card. 800. The crowd turned to look at him. Gary Summers laughed. Actually laughed out loud. Martin Hayes. Should have known. Only guy in the county still farming with equipment older than his kids. A few people chuckled. Martin's face reddened, but he kept his card up. I got 800, the auctioneer said quickly. Do I hear 9? Silence. Going once at 800. Twice. Sold to bidder 73 for $800. Martin walked up to settle his bill. As he passed Gary Summers, the dealer shook his head. Martin, you just bought a 30-year-old tractor that's worth maybe 500. Hope you didn't need that $300 for anything important. I'll manage, Martin said quietly. You know what your problem is? You're stuck in the past, running paid-off junk while everyone else is modernizing. That's why you're still farming the same 200 acres your daddy left you. That's why you'll never get ahead. Martin didn't respond, just paid his $800, got his receipt, and went to hook up his new tractor. But he remembered what Gary said, remembered the mocking tone, remembered the assumption that paid-off equipment meant failure and debt meant success. And over the next 15 years, Martin Hayes set out to prove that assumption was backwards. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about collecting old tractors. This isn't about being nostalgic or stubborn or resistant to change. This is about a man who understood that the fastest way to build wealth is to never send money to banks for things that lose value. And if you want to know how an $800 tractor purchase in 1983 led to owning 3 farms by 1998, hit that subscribe button right now, because the strategy Martin used contradicts everything the agricultural industry tells farmers about growth and success. Let me take you back to understand who Martin Hayes was in 1983. He was 34 years old, farming 200 acres his father had left him when he died in 1977. The land was paid off, which was something, but it wasn't enough ground to make a comfortable living. Most years, Martin netted around $12,000 after expenses. Enough to get by, not enough to get ahead. Martin ran wheat mostly, some milo, kept a small cow-calf operation going on the marginal ground. His equipment was old, but maintained. He had a 1951 Farmall M for fieldwork, a 1960 International 560 for heavier pulling, and a collection of implements that averaged 20 years old. Everything was paid for, everything worked, and by the standards of modern agriculture in 1983, everything was obsolete. Martin's neighbors were farming bigger, leasing more ground, running newer equipment, expanding their operations on credit. That was the advice everyone got: scale up, leverage debt, grow or die. Martin watched them do it. Watched them sign financing agreements for $40,000 tractors. Watched them lease ground they could barely afford to farm. Watched them chase growth like it was the only measure of success. And Martin made a different choice. He decided that instead of spending money on new equipment and borrowed ground, he would save every dollar he didn't absolutely have to spend. That instead of making payments to banks and dealers, he would accumulate cash. That instead of looking successful, he would become successful. It was a slow strategy, an unglamorous strategy, a strategy that made people think he was failing when actually he was doing exactly what he intended. By November of 1983, Martin had $23,000 in savings, money he'd accumulated over 6 years by living cheap, maintaining old equipment, and resisting every temptation to spend. Most farmers would have used that money as a down payment on more land or newer equipment, would have leveraged it into a loan 3 or 4 times larger, would have expanded. Martin was saving it for something else. He was waiting for other farmers to fail. The farm crisis was already starting in 1983, though most people didn't realize how bad it would get. Land values were starting to drop. Interest rates were climbing. Farmers who'd expanded aggressively in the late 70s were starting to feel pressure. Martin saw it coming. Saw the math that didn't work. Saw the debt loads that couldn't be sustained if anything went wrong. And he knew that when things got bad, land would get cheap, equipment would get cheap, opportunity would exist for anyone who had cash and no debt. So when he bought that Farmall Super M for $800 at Ed Pritchard's auction, it wasn't sentiment, and it wasn't stubbornness, it was strategy. That tractor was worth at least $2,000 in working condition. Martin knew he could put $400 into it and have a reliable machine worth 3 times what he paid. That wasn't collecting, that was investing. He took the Super M home, spent 3 weekends going through it completely. New fluids, new filters, valve adjustment, carburetor rebuild, brake work, electrical cleanup, total cost $370 in parts. When he was done, he had a tractor that would run another 20 years. Total investment $1,170. Market value, if he sold it, $2,500 minimum. But Martin wasn't planning to sell it. He was planning to use it to farm land that desperate farmers would soon be selling for pennies on the dollar. Let me stop here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at something everyone else thought was worthless and saw value? When was the last time you invested in something unfashionable because the math made sense? Drop a comment, because Martin Hayes built an empire on seeing value where others saw junk. The farm crisis hit hard in 1984 and 1985. Land values crashed. Wheat prices stayed low. Farmers who'd expanded on credit found themselves trapped. Equipment auctions happened every month. Foreclosure sales, estate liquidations, retirement sales from farmers who were getting out while they could. Most farmers stayed away from these auctions. Too depressing, too close to home. Nobody wanted to watch their neighbors lose everything. Martin went to every single one. Not to gawk, not to gossip, to buy. Between 1984 and 1986, Martin bought 6 more tractors at auctions. Not new ones, not even particularly nice ones. Old machines that ran but looked rough. Farmalls, Internationals, one Alice Chalmers, average price paid, $750 per tractor. Average invested in repairs, $400 per tractor. Average market value after repairs, $2,200 per tractor. Martin wasn't collecting tractors. He was building inventory, creating a stable of working machines that he owned outright, that he could maintain himself, that would never require a payment to anyone. His neighbors thought he was crazy. Gary Summers, the John Deere dealer who'd mocked him at Ed Pritchard's auction, told people Martin was a hoarder, a junk collector, a farmer who couldn't let go of the past. But Martin wasn't collecting junk. He was accumulating capital in a form nobody else valued, and he was about to use that capital in a way nobody expected. In August of 1986, the farm next to Martin's went up for auction. 240 acres, decent ground, owned by a farmer named Bob Mitchell, who'd expanded too fast in 1980 and couldn't service his debt when prices dropped. The land was clean. No buildings except an old barn. No house. Just raw farmland. At the peak of the market in 1979, that ground would have sold for $1,200 an acre. Maybe $300,000 total. In August of 1986, the opening bid was $600 an acre. Martin had been to the bank the week before, talked to the loan officer, explained what he wanted to do. "Martin, you want to buy the Mitchell place?" "I do. Can you make a down payment?" "I can pay cash." The loan officer blinked. "Cash? I've got $31,000 in savings. The ground will probably sell for less than that. I can pay cash and own it free and clear." "Martin, nobody buys land with cash anymore. You should finance it. Keep your savings for operating expenses." "Why would I pay interest on money I already have?" Because that's how farming works now. You leverage your capital to expand faster." "I don't want to expand faster. I want to expand safely. Can't lose what you don't owe." The loan officer didn't understand, but he arranged for Martin to have a cashier's check ready for auction day. The bidding started at $600 an acre, went to $650, $700, stalled at $725. The auctioneer worked the crowd. "Come on, folks, this is good ground. Who'll give me $750? Silence. Martin raised his card. $750. One other bidder went to $775. Martin bid $800. The other bidder dropped out. Sold to bidder 41 for $800 an acre. 240 acres at $800 per acre. $192,000. Martin walked up to the cashier's table with his check, paid in full, owned the land outright before the sun set. Gary Summers was at that auction, heard about the cash purchase, found Martin afterward. "You paid cash for that ground?" "I did." "You're insane. You just tied up every dollar you have in land that's losing value. Should have financed it, kept your cash liquid, or I could own it and not have a payment." "Martin, you're never going to get ahead thinking like that. You're still going to be farming the same 400 acres 10 years from now, while everyone else is running 1,000-acre operations." Martin just smiled. "We'll see." Here's what Gary Summers didn't understand, what most farmers didn't understand, what the whole agricultural finance industry didn't want farmers to understand. Debt amplifies everything. When times are good, it amplifies growth. But when times are bad, it amplifies failure. And in farming, times are bad more often than anyone wants to admit. Martin's strategy was the opposite. Zero amplification, zero leverage, zero risk of losing everything if one bad year happened. He would grow slower than leveraged farmers, but he would grow steadier, and he would never ever go backwards. If you're understanding this, if you're seeing why Martin's strategy was brilliant and not crazy, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Martin farmed his new 440 acres the same way he'd farmed his original 200. Old tractors, maintained equipment, low overhead. His income jumped, not doubled, but close. He was clearing about $19,000 a year now after expenses, still living cheap, still banking most of what he made, and still going to every auction in the county. Between 1987 and 1990, Martin bought 3 more pieces of ground, small parcels, 40 acres here, 80 acres there. Awkward pieces that didn't fit other people's operations but made sense for Martin's. He paid cash for all of them, never financed, never leveraged, just saved money and bought when opportunities appeared. By 1991, Martin owned 600 acres, all paid off, all farmed with equipment that averaged 30 years old, all generating income that went straight to savings because there were no payments to make. His neighbors were bigger, farmed more ground, ran newer equipment, looked more successful. But Martin had something they didn't: complete financial security. No land debt, no equipment debt, no operating debt, nothing that could take his farm away if prices dropped or weather failed or markets crashed. The second wave of the farm crisis hit in the early 90s. Not as dramatic as the mid-80s, but brutal for farmers who'd survived the first wave by refinancing and holding on. More auctions, more opportunities. In 1993, an entire farm came up for sale 2 miles from Martin's place. House, barn, machine shed, 280 acres. The owner had died, the heirs wanted out. Nobody local wanted to make an offer because times were still tight. Starting bid, $200,000 for everything. Martin had $160,000 in savings at that point. He'd been farming for 16 years, saving aggressively, buying strategically, building towards something most people couldn't see. He bid $200,000. Nobody counted. Paid cash. Owned his second complete farm, same year, same strategy. Now farming 920 acres across 3 separate properties, everything owned outright. Gary Summers heard about it, couldn't believe it. Drove out to Martin's place one afternoon. "Martin, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "How are you doing this? You're buying farms with cash while everyone else can barely make their payments. What's your secret?" Martin set down the wrench he'd been using to adjust his planter. "No secret, Gary. I don't make payments. Haven't for 16 years. Every dollar I earn either goes into savings or back into the operation. There's no middleman taking a cut. But you're farming with equipment from the 50s. Equipment that works and doesn't require payments. You told me at Ed Pritchard's auction that old equipment was holding me back. But I've bought 3 farms since then. How many farms have your customers bought?" Gary didn't have an answer. "The difference, Gary, is that your customers send thousands of dollars a month to banks and equipment companies. I keep that money, and over time, that money buys land." By 1998, 15 years after Gary Summers had mocked Martin's $800 Farmall purchase at Ed Pritchard's auction, Martin Hayes owned 3 complete farms. Total acreage, 1,400 acres. Total debt, 0. Market value of the land, roughly $1.4 million. Total amount Martin had paid for everything, around $600,000 over 15 years. Equity, $800,000. And the kicker? Martin was still farming with equipment that averaged 30 years old, still maintaining it himself, still refusing to make payments for things that lost value. His neighbors who'd financed new equipment in the early 80s, most of them were gone, foreclosed or sold out or barely hanging on. The farmers who'd leveraged their operations to scale up fast, most of them had scaled right back down or out completely. Martin Hayes, the guy who was mocked for buying paid-off junk at auctions, had quietly built an empire while everyone else was trying to look successful. In 2002, Martin was invited to speak at a farm management conference in Manhattan, Kansas. The organizers wanted him to explain how he'd expanded from 200 to 1,400 acres in 20 years without ever taking on debt. Martin stood at the podium, looked out at 200 farmers, and told them the truth. "I didn't build this by being the best farmer," he said. "I built it by being the most patient investor. I recognized that in farming, land is the asset that appreciates, and equipment is the expense that depreciates. So I minimized the expense and maximized the asset." "How?" someone asked. "By never sending money to banks for equipment, by buying old machines that worked for pennies on the dollar, by maintaining them myself so I didn't need dealers or mechanics, by saving the difference between what I paid and what everyone else was paying, and by waiting for everyone else's debt to create opportunities for me. But didn't you fall behind? Didn't you lose competitive advantage running old equipment? Martin smiled. Behind who? I own 1,400 acres, free and clear. I net about $60,000 a year after expenses. I have no debt, no payments, no financial stress. Most of the farmers who were ahead of me in 1983 are gone now. So who was really behind? The room was silent. The industry wants you to believe that debt is normal, that payments are just part of farming, that you can't succeed without leverage, but I'm living proof that's a lie. You don't need debt. You need discipline. You don't need new equipment. You need knowledge. And you don't need to scale fast. You need to scale safely. He paused. The John Deere dealer mocked my paid-off Farmall at an auction in 1983. 15 years later, I had 3 farms, and he was still making a living off other people's debt. The question isn't who had better equipment. The question is, who's still standing? The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. After the speech, dozens of farmers crowded around Martin, asking questions, taking notes, wanting to know specifics about how he'd done it, and Martin helped every single one of them, gave them his philosophy, his strategies, his math. It's not complicated, he told them. Spend less than you make. Save the difference. Buy assets when they're cheap. Never leverage yourself into a position where one bad year can ruin you. That's it. That's the whole secret. Martin Hayes is 75 years old now. He sold one of his farms in 2015 and retired from active farming. Leased the other 2 to young farmers he mentored. The 1953 Farmall Super M he bought for $800 at Ed Pritchard's auction in 1983. Still running, still working on one of the farms. 41 years after he bought it, that tractor is still generating value. Total invested over 41 years. Approximately $8,000 in maintenance and parts. Total value generated, impossible to calculate. But that tractor helped farm the land that became a $1 million empire. Gary Summers, the John Deere dealer who mocked Martin at that auction, retired in 2005, sold his dealership. At his retirement party, someone brought up the story about Martin Hayes. "You were wrong about him," someone said. Gary nodded. "I was wrong about a lot of things. Wrong about debt being necessary, wrong about old equipment being worthless, wrong about the whole system really. Martin figured out what I never did, that the goal isn't to sell more, it's to owe less. So let me leave you with this. Right now, someone is trying to convince you that you need to spend money to make money, that you need new equipment to compete, that debt is just a tool and leverage is necessary for growth. But Martin Hayes proved something different. He proved that the fastest way to build wealth is to stop sending money to banks. That paid-off equipment beats financed equipment every time. That patience beats aggression. That ownership beats leverage. The John Deere dealer mocked his paid-off Farmall at an auction in 1983. 15 years later, Martin had 3 farms worth over $1 million. And that Farmall was still running. If this story changed how you think about equipment, debt, and building wealth in agriculture, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about farmers who built empires by refusing to follow conventional wisdom. Second, drop a comment telling me, what old equipment are you running that people say you should replace? Third, share this with someone who's feeling pressure to finance equipment or expansion they can't afford. The dealer mocked the paid-off Farmall, but that Farmall helped buy 3 farms, while the dealer's customers lost theirs. Choose ownership, choose patience, choose building something that lasts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.